ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Zombie Train. This is episode number 314, and I am your host, the Admiral Ellis. Still not sure how to line that up right and say that properly. I'll work it out. I'll settle on something sooner or later. This week, of course, we're watching footage from the most recent Under Construction, and we have a question from CSX-68 Midwest and Western Railroad, I think. It's quite a mouthful of a name. Yep, that's what it is. He wrote verbatim, possibility of running into an EMD SD40-2 in the future, and what did you do with Mount St. Helens ruins of machinery? I'm not totally certain of what you're trying to ask there. We didn't really have any issues with Mount St. Helens in particular. It's not an overly active volcano. When we went out west, it didn't pose any problems to us. I mean, the locals were more concerned about Mount Rainier, which I'm not sure if it's more justified or not, because I'm not a geologist. I don't know these things, and I didn't exactly have one on staff to ask. But we, personally, in my adventuring, really around the world during the course of the Zombie Train and the Zombie Train Incorporated, never seen a volcano erupting. I never have. So, and I don't think one has ever truly impacted us. So, Mount St. Helens, despite being something that I really did like Mount St. Helens as a kid. I was fascinated by it as a kid. And one of the things I had when I was growing up, I remember it was like a National Geographic cover, and it's a blue pickup driving away from the pyroclastic flow, the massive cloud in the background. I don't know, I was really into volcanoes as a kid. I mean, I think we all were at some point, but, it's like that and dinosaurs, right? But this is not a show to talk about that. SD40-2s, though, are really that era of diesels. They really became the backbone of the Zombie Train Incorporated once we were able to nail down oil production. And not just oil production, but oil refining and diesel and, that sort of thing. There was a point in time where we had finally gotten that squared away, and we were ready to move away from steam and steam power. Which necessitated it was a huge paradigm shift in the Zombie Train Incorporated, because before then, we were investing tons of resources. And I'm not just talking about the metal. I'm talking about the manpower, the education, everything, into getting a functional fleet of steam locomotives that would work for our goals. Because, we could have rushed diesel at the very beginning, but we just didn't know when we'd be able to get our hands on it, and where, and how, and we knew the Navy also really cared about having, diesel and, diesel, etc., diesel and other gasoline products for their ships and for their equipment, and they cared very heavily about that. And I knew if we went for it right away, we would basically be forfeiting the ability to grow as quickly as we'd like. Because, yeah, we would have it, but the Navy would probably be requisitioning it pretty heavily, because that would give them the opportunity to grow in a time when they really, really needed it. So we decided not to pursue that course of action and to let them basically get along with their nuclear fleet, and that's about it. And their reserves, etc. Until we had a basis where we knew that even if we stumbled into an unlimited stockpile of diesel, we would be able to have an effective railroad system without relying on that stockpile. So we went for coal and steam first. There were other reasons, but that was one of them. So by the time that we got the ability to refine crude oil again, which we had to go to Europe, literally to Europe, recover some components, recover some people who knew what they were doing, and bring them back to North America, basically. And then we could start putting them to work and rebuilding refineries and stuff like that. So, that was a few years on. We had an effective and quite expansive steam locomotive fleet, which was not quite equal parts, but, maybe 3/4 of it was recovered steam locomotives that had been in museums or had been sidelined or whatever, and that we had worked up back to operational status and were using all over the place. And then the remaining quarter or so, probably less than that, honestly, if you count all the little engines that we had, was new build engines built on basically an upgraded L1 design. I've talked about that before. And just to say, the reason we chose that design is because not only were the schematics easily available, the engines were relatively simple, being like a 1914 original design, and there were only a couple of modifications that we had to do. And also they were designed to be totally, parts interchangeable. You run it until it wears out and then you replace it with a new one. And that was something that we were capable of doing. We didn't necessarily need to, or we didn't necessarily want to even, have to create parts that had really, really tight tolerances and needed a lot of expertise and a lot of tooling to get exactly right, to get them to work right. We weren't going to go and build the late 1945 designs or whatever, for the most part, because of the technology involved in doing that. You can build a lot of the older classes of locomotives, with 19th or even 18th century technology, because it's just putting pieces of metal together, It's not really rocket science, but as time goes on, as you advance into the mid-century, there were these designs that had come out that had some really, really complicated inner workings, for one, really tough metallurgy to match, and that needed a lot of TLC comparatively. But railroads could do that because, well, they could do that. They had the equipment and the manpower and everything like that, and the technology base to back it up. We didn't have any of that. So, we went for these older style locomotives that were easy to build, easy to maintain, and easily replaceable when something went wrong. Very quick and cheap and dirty. And, we had to make a few modifications to bring them up to the spec that we wanted to, but by and large it was just based on that sort of frame. Anyway, the SD40s, or the locomotives of that era, the second, well no, would that be second or third? That would be third generation EMDs in particular, just being very easy to work with, comparatively speaking. If you go back further, things were kind of janky, and there wasn't really a huge advantage over steam power. Even like the U-boats and stuff, we weren't going to deal with anything that had fallen out of production, like Alcos or Baldwins. But there were definitely a couple of them kicking around that were operational. By and large, we were looking for those third generation EMDs and occasionally Gs, and I mean that, and then the occasional passenger locomotive that was thrown in, like a Siemens or something. But that's getting into the more modern stuff that we tried to get away from because it got a little bit too complicated for us to effectively work on and effectively maintain and run. A lot of the most modern engines, they hadn't quite gotten there, but they were like looking at almost like an internet connectivity, that was expected to have. And the engines would sort of have an aneurysm without that, and we had no way to fix that because we were not in charge of rebuilding the global broadband network. We were trying to, make a railroad run, but that meant that we had to basically sideline almost all of the modern locomotives for one reason or another. And so falling back on these, SDs and GPs, SD40s, of course, being, 40-2s, SDs and GPs, being the backbone of a lot of railroads, including, Class 2s and 3s, but also being heavily featured in Class 1 rosters, back before the war. They were pretty plentiful. We never had a problem getting our hands on more of those, even to the point of we never had to build one of our own. We had to cannibalize some sometimes, but that's just more to the point of there were enough around for us to cannibalize. Like, we didn't think, like with the steam engines, that having to take a locomotive out of service permanently or indefinitely to bring another one into service was a sacrifice. It was, okay, we've got 5 locomotives to start with. We've got enough parts to probably get 3 running. That's good. That's a +3 that we've got there. It's better than 0 by far, and we're not really losing anything because we have, we have the opportunity to get some engines out of this, and to come back to what I was talking about at the beginning of the episode, we didn't really have a huge rush to get the diesels in service. We were having a little bit of a power crunch, and yeah, that did mean that we wanted them in service. We did want to get, we did want to bolster our fleet and then, transition. But because of the fact that the Navy, once we had fuel, the Navy was taking a lot of it, unsurprisingly, and we had an effective locomotive roster. We had an effective physical plant, I guess would be the word for it. We didn't really need to rush those diesels into completion. We didn't need to rush them out the door. And that helped because, it meant that every diesel we had was a bonus. It was a gift, more, or, almost, in a way. And what was the other thing? I was going to add something onto that, and I can't remember what it is now. Yeah, every diesel that we got was just a addition onto what we had. And eventually we got enough of them that we started to be able to phase out the steam locomotives, return them to museums or wherever they had started, parks, etc. We still maintain a reserve fleet, but not in any significant capacity. We just, we have our roundhouses and stuff that we had based steam out of, and then some, now that we have access to a lot of urban areas that we didn't have access to during this transition period. The main bases, they still do have a complement of steam locomotives. And a lot of them are the L1s. The L3s, I guess, is what they would be, because there were L2s under Pensy. Yeah. So yeah, we never made a unified locomotive roster. That was a missed opportunity, I think. But we had so many different classes of engines, etc., that we really just we broke stuff down by wheel arrangement and then further by tractive effort. It was, okay, we need probably a Pacific for this. Check the Pacifics, what's available. Okay, these guys are powerful enough to do what we needed to do. It was only about 1,200 engines, give or take, that we ever had. Absolute peak maximum, and even that's probably overstating it slightly. So it was easy to keep track of them all, relatively speaking. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you got any questions, feel free to post them below, and I will see you next week. Trainman out.